Except that every word that you just uttered is something that we know to be real that is a potential explanation. God is not.
Why?
We don't know God to be, we know elephants are real. We don't know the same about God. You can't show me a God.
Okay, that's
all you can do is, and this is why you're not arguing for a specific God or presenting evidence for a God. You're arguing that there needs to be some explanation for the universe, or there needs to be some explanation for consciousness. You literally said, God, you are merely defining as that which is sufficient as an explanation for whichever of those arguments.
How do you tell the difference between something that's genuinely supernatural and something we simply don't understand yet? That's the question that drives this intense exchange between Matt Dillahunty and Mike Jones, and it quickly turns into a much bigger discussion about evidence, philosophy, and the standards we use to decide what's actually true. If someone claims the supernatural is real, what would they have to demonstrate before anyone should believe them? Don't forget to click like, subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it.
I have a question. What do you mean? You said, it's demonstrable. We need to demonstrate. Braxton Hunter brought this up with you in his debate as well. What does this mean? How do we demonstrate something in your view, or what do you mean by that?
So it's a good question, because a lot of times when we're talking about these things, we'll use a word and everybody just assumes they know what it means, and maybe we're not even talking about the same thing. So for me, something that's demonstrable is something that we can, everything that we get through our senses and exploration. So can we set aside the problem of hard solipsism and just agree that we're sharing a universe?
Fair enough.
Sweet. As long as we're sharing a universe, then I have a way to demonstrate to myself and to others independently and get their confirmation of what is or isn't in this can, or that there is a can. It doesn't mean that the explanation itself needs to be materialistic, but because we are physical beings in a material world, that demonstration needs to be physical. And I'm not saying there could be a supernatural being, for example, that can interact, that can do miracles, that can do mind reading, that can do that kind of stuff. But there would be a manifestation in reality that is detectable, identifiable, discoverable. And that means that some things are going to need to be repeatable, like a single occurrence is almost always going to be incredibly difficult for anybody to reasonably accept, unless it is in a category of something that is mundane. Like, I dropped my pen. Oops, now it's in the past. How do we explore the past? How do we investigate the past? Oh, somebody could have recorded this and it's an edited thing. Apart from the actual instant of doing it, how would I go about demonstrating it? Well, maybe we can go to the recording. Maybe we can go to the fact that it's live. Maybe we can see that the pen is on the floor. Maybe then we can make an abductive or an inference about what the best explanation is. At the end of the day, though, the claim that I knocked a pen on the floor, not a big deal.
You talked about the past. Now, you and I both accept the theory of evolution. Now, I have debated young Earth creationists. I'm debating one next month in Toronto. They say this kind of same stuff, is you can't demonstrate that single-celled organisms slowly evolved into hominids. And I go, I actually just say, yeah, I can't because I don't have a time machine. But I do have a lot of evidence, radiometric dating, looking at different transitional fossils, and I can make a good explanation arguing to the best inference.
Right.
I'm trying to do the same thing here. I'm saying, look at all this data we have.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm saying we look at all this data we have. We have correlations, quantum cognition. We have evidence of mental correlations there. We have strong evidence of top-down causation from consciousness. We have no evidence of consciousness being reduced to matter, yet we have plenty of evidence matter can reduce to consciousness just from basic philosophy like David Hume's bundle theory or some of the stuff I was talking about earlier. It just seems like this is the best explanation for the same reason I accept the theory of evolution. It's the best explanation.
Except that when we're talking about things like radiometric dating, all of the different components of what we're talking to build our inference, because science is all inference. So everything that we're using to build that is something else that is demonstrable. So we're taking sturdy bits of things where we talk about, you and I could probably have fun with a young Earth creationist at some point, because I love when they do the, carbon dating is only good to 50,000 years. Hey, you're right.
Yeah,
you're actually correct, but it overlaps with a bunch of others. And that is that overlap that builds a case that is so compelling that we can have a reasonably good way of dating things to determine how old something is. Are there going to be mistakes, anomalies? You betcha. And that's already accounted for in statistical analysis. And it's about being as right as we reasonably can. At no point in modeling the theory of evolution, which is what you're going to get from like young Earth creationists, is it, hey, this seems a lot like this, and so we're going to appeal to something else. So mind comes from mind. Well, first of all, mind isn't particularly well defined, and there's disagreement about, is it the mind a product of the brain? Is it what the brain does? Is it a thing that actually exists, or is it an emergent property of something that exists? Like wetness from water type thing. Wetness doesn't exist. It is the interaction of particles, in a fluid.
I would disagree.
You think wetness exists?
No, I would not say it emerges from matter. Wetness is a mental property that we experience when we interact with water. It emerges in consciousness. I have no idea how to say that matter would create wetness, because wetness is a physical sensation that we experience in our mental reality.
One definition of wetness is certainly based on what we actually experience, although maybe everything is based on what we actually experience.
That's one of the arguments
and describe that. However, there's a property of, there's two distinct things, piece of paper and fluid. And it's a property of how a fluid interacts with us that we describe as wet. That property isn't just us experiencing, our experience is tied to it. It is something about our interaction with that.
Well, I would agree. I mean, I agree. My argument coming back to that, though, is the way we're going to describe that piece of paper, it's purely in terms of mental properties, the way it feels, the way it looks, its sensations. Just to invoke the, Occam's razor, why invoke an entire substance? Why not invoke just mental phenomena, mental information kind of thing? Because that's one of my main arguments. We live in a giant mental reality, and I use this word very importantly, analogous to like some sort of simulation. Why pause it like when you're playing a video game? There's this discrete room you're walking into, and when you walk out, it's still there. Well, no, it's just code merging from the code kind of thing. When you take David Hume's bundle theory, he talks about physical objects. You can explain everything in terms of their properties, their mental properties. Take away all the properties, what do you got? Well, nothing. So why posit? So just invoke Occam's razor. Why posit a discrete material substance beyond the mental there?
I don't know that I am positing that. So one of the things.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'm interested.
So if you take away all of the physical properties or all the physical components of something, you also take away all of its ability to interact with anything else. There doesn't have to be a mental experience for there to be friction. It doesn't have to be a mental experience for there to be a strong nuclear force or a weak nuclear force. You take away these things, it's about how they interact. And our interaction with a water or fluid, we describe that as wet. But also the wetness, this reduction in friction and the ability to slide over, occurs all the time, even without our experience. It occurs between the molecules interaction and between water's interaction with other things. There's a reason why we can use a water cutter to cut through metal, even though dripping water on metal isn't going to do it. It's because the interactions between them, which isn't our experience, is something that we can then describe. Ooh, that's rough interaction, that's friction interaction.
I like where you're going, because you're describing everything in terms of physics, and that's what I agree with. Physics reduces to mathematics. Again, it all reduces to information. Whether we're describing things by mental sensations, mental phenomena, or physics, we're all describing it in terms of information, basically. And in terms of information, I want to make sure, let me define this. I'm going off C.E. Shannon's 1948, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. So if materialism is true, information refers to material arrangements. If idealism is true or substance dualism is true, information will refer to phenomenal states that can be qualitatively discerned from one another. Qualia, sound, sensations, thoughts, mathematics, mental phenomena. He strictly says, so when I talk about information, I want to be clear what I'm actually describing here. I'm referring to mental phenomena. Now, if we don't have any evidence for the material beyond what we're sensing, experiencing, why not just explain it in terms of the information itself, which would be an idealistic account, and it gets us right back to where we were.
Well, it would be arguing for some version of hard solipsism.
I would disagree completely.
So would you agree with me that if we removed every thinking mind from the universe, friction is still something that is going to occur in the universe?
Not the physical emergence of it, but the information of it just happening there.
One thing that stood out is how the conversation shifted from explaining reality to simply renaming it. Saying everything is information might sound profound, but it doesn't actually answer the question Matt is asking. Information always has to be information about something. It has structure, relationships, distinctions. So the obvious follow-up is, what gives rise to those distinctions in the first place? That's why Matt keeps coming back to demonstration. He's not asking for a different vocabulary, he's asking for a framework that actually does more explanatory work. If your theory can accommodate literally any observation without ever risking being wrong, it's hard to see what it's adding beyond a new way of describing the same mystery. A good explanation doesn't just sound deeper, it narrows the possibilities.
So to give an analogy, going back to the video game thing, if you have, let's say you're in an RPG game, you come across some sort of site that you could see like train track friction that happened in that video game's past, it didn't physically happen, like the information arrangement got there, but there was no physical observers to sort of cause collapse, to observe the physical phenomena. But you can still have the underlying information processing taking place to get you to that point. So the difference I'm distinguishing here between the information and the material.
So it seems, and I don't want to lay down a trick route to get here. I just legitimately want to understand this.
Yeah.
Because it seems what's happening is you have a view and it's going to lead to an eventual collapse at some point. Because, for example, if this is all just information and is contingent upon a mind, then you can't have evolution at all. You can't have chemicals interacting because there's no mind there. And so therefore you posit a God mind to serve as that which is going to collapse.
That's not what I would
Okay,
take.
then how do you solve that?
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So in terms of that, though, I don't say that, I talk about this in my video on the cosmic conscious argument. I don't say that God is sort of like, has some sort of giant eyeball looking down on space and some sort of globe or whatnot. So the evolution of the wave function is deterministic. This is something Lawrence Krauss said in his debate with, I forget, I think it was Dinesh D'Souza or something. I can't remember exactly. That wave function is still deterministic. The information within the wave function is still deterministically evolving to get to a certain point. When it comes in contact with a conscious observer, all that happens is it collapses to the physical appearance of it. So as Fred Kuttner, Bruce Rosenblum say in their book, The Quantum Enigma, absence of there being a physical particle there, it's just the wave function, the evolution of that information. And then when an observer comes in, it causes sort of like the collapse of the physical particle. Best way I can explain it is an analogy. I found the analogy works really well. The video game, you have these sort of getting to that certain point when a conscious observer comes in, the information is building up. All the observer does is just cause physical collapse, but the information was still there.
Which observer? The person playing the game?
The person playing the game. Yeah.
So now, if I step away from the game and it keeps going without me and there's not another person involved, nothing's happening within that simulated reality?
I'm referring to the avatar, the person you are using. If you were in a video game room and then you walk out of that room, does the room still exist in some sort of absolute space setting?
Well, first of all, it depends.
Well, no, it doesn't.
It does depend. Hang on. It depends on the type of game we're talking about. Because if the game is a simulation of a house that doesn't remove the rooms so that you can go in and out of them, then that room is still being essentially rendered within the engine of the game, even though you're not in that room to look at it.
But it's not on the screen, so all that it exists.
Okay, the screen, that's like saying if I close my eyes, does the world go away?
Well, I mean, I'm not actually arguing that because I understand decoherence. So,
but you are arguing that because you just said if it's not on the screen, it can't be said to exist.
well, I'm using that as an analogy. Remember, I made that very specific. I'm using this as an analogy.
Okay.
So,
but it goes back to the question that I was asking, which is if there aren't any thinking minds in the universe, do things like friction and do chemical molecules interact? And the answer is yes, they must.
well, they interact in an information setting, but there's no reason to just posit they would sort of exist in the space-time temporal setting because there's no need for them to be. It's, again, the wave function would just simply be deterministic without collapsing to a definite position.
It's if you're saying if we eliminated every thinking mind in the universe right now, that everything would stop because there'd be nothing to collapse the waveform.
Well, essentially, yes, that's what I'm arguing.
Okay. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to possibly argue against that. That seems to me to be an unfalsifiable proposition that violates Occam's razor.
Actually,
because
no. I could argue that it is falsifiable. You have to find hidden variables within quantum mechanics because it goes back to what I was talking about in my opening setting. So there was an experiment called the confirmation of the Cauchy-Spector theorem. The Cauchy-Spector theorem argues that non-contextuality is incompatible with quantum mechanics. Now, what does that mean? Let me sum it up in a quote from Anton Zellinger. He says, what we perceive as reality now depends on our decision of what to measure, which is a very interesting implication about the universe. We're not just passive observers, end quote. So what he's basically arguing is that the Cauchy-Spector theorem, which was confirmed in 2011, does actually show that we aren't passive observers. We are playing an intricate role. 2006, 2007, there was something called the violation of the Leggett inequality. They falsified all non-local hidden variables that were testable. Now, it is possible there are some hidden variables, like maybe the Bohmian wave and Bohmian mechanics, is somehow giving us the illusion that the observer is somehow playing a role. The problem is there's just no evidence for it, and the most likely explanation is that observers actually are playing a role. This is why I rely so much on people like Fred Kuttner, Henry Stapp, who have argued for this, that we just have to follow the philosophical conclusions to what's actually showing us.
So curiously, while I'm not a physicist, some of the physicists that you've cited and referenced, like Sean Carroll, obviously doesn't agree with the conclusions that you reach on it.
Nope.
I don't have any expertise in this area, and yet as we sit here talking about whether or not the world would cease to exist if we removed all thinking minds, and you seem to think that one of these models has essentially found a way to falsify that, I'm unaware of it. I'm not just doing the subjective unconvinced, but I don't know how this gets us to a God.
Well, that goes back to my original arguments I gave. So the universe, once again, is emerging from consciousness.
But this is all just by analogy. So in the same way that you're saying this model would seem to suggest that a materialistic view, a standard materialistic view, just doesn't work. And so therefore there must be a God. However, what there must be if a materialistic view, which I think we would all agree is incomplete and is never asserted to be complete. So the real situation that we have is our current understanding within a materialistic view, even not just philosophically materialist, but a methodologically materialistic view, where we just don't get to appeal to the supernatural until such time as it gets to, it demonstrates, it's been demonstrated to be real and be able to affect reality. A materialistic view doesn't have all the answers, and we don't have enough information, or we don't have a good enough understanding to say things, and therefore it's plausible to say that there must be some sort of non-materialistic explanation there. How do you determine that it's more plausible to suggest a non-materialistic explanation than it is to suggest that there's a materialistic explanation that we are as yet unaware of?
Have you ever read a book called For and
Nope.
Against?
I've never read a book.
Well, let me pour you a drink then.
Cool.
Have you read a book called For and Against Method by Emery Lakatos and Paul
No.
Feyerabend? It's a pretty good book on philosophy of science. I always recommend it when people want to learn how science is done. In that book, Emery Lakatos is trying to respond to Paul Feyerabend, who is famous for trying to argue that science is like art. And he's recognizing the subjectivity of scientists, but he's also responding and trying to save the objectivity of science. And one of the things he talks about is degenerate and progressive research programs. You asked, how do I know about it's more probable that it's an immaterial, otherwise a non-material explanation? Because right now, as you were talking about, and all the evidence I was giving, the materialistic research program is degenerate. It's having to get more ad hoc to explain things away. Now, that doesn't prove I'm right, the materialism is wrong. It does lend credence to the idea it isn't. The second way I do it is the same way I would respond to young earth creationists. When they say, well, how do you know God just didn't make it that way? I'm saying, well, yeah, it's possible, but it's not likely given the current data. If we find more data in the future to support that, then I'll take that view. So when you say, how do I know it's not a future materialistic explanation? Very well could be. Let's wait to see what actually happens. But for right now, I'm going to argue this is the best explanation given our current data and our current understanding.
Okay, so that didn't really answer the question I asked, I think, because if basically it was, my point was that we don't have a materialistic explanation for X, and that we also understand that we don't have a full understanding, and that every time we found an explanation for X, it's been material to, or whatever X. And here we are without an explanation for something, and you are positing that a supernatural explanation or a non-material explanation is more plausible or more probable than a material explanation that we don't know. And when asked why you would think it's more plausible or more probable, you talk about basically complaining that people are doing materialism wrong, that materialism is collapsing on itself. Materialism isn't collapsing on itself. Maybe people are doing things wrong. Just like the science isn't going to collapse on itself. Now, materialism asserting that it is the one and only explanation for stuff, that's something that I don't accept and haven't put forward anyway, because I don't know how you could demonstrate that in the first place, that every explanation needs to be material. But I live in a world where every time we've explained something, it's been material. At no point have we ever explained something and confirmed that the explanation is supernatural. And throughout history, people have said, hey, materialism doesn't have an explanation for this, therefore I'm going to posit a supernatural explanation and say that it is the best current explanation we have. And like I pointed out earlier, it may be the case that it's the best explanation, even though it's not an explanation at all. It doesn't have any explanatory power. It is just it is indistinguishable from saying magic did it or mystery did it or whatever else. It's just we put a label on it. And so if we've gone through this and have yet to confirm anything supernatural, I don't know how you could say that it's more likely that the explanation is supernatural until such time as we find a natural explanation or material explanation. But what's worse than that is that what you said was that I'm going to keep believing it's supernatural until we come up with a material explanation. It's literally, I mean,
well, first of all,
we can rewind. That's what you were saying, that this is the best explanation, so I'm going to accept it. And my objection here is that accepting what you find to be the best explanation and then putting a burden of proof on someone to show you wrong, which you've done repeatedly, from your opening statement right up until just a minute ago, from your opening statement where you're like, here's what Matt needs to do. He needs to come up with a more plausible explanation than the one I've offered. That's not the way reason works. Reason isn't just, nobody else has come up with an explanation, nobody else has come up with a better explanation, so I'm just going to go with this one. That's not what skepticism is. That's not how reasoning works. That's not critical thinking. The real position is to proportion your confidence to the actual evidence for something and to accept something tentatively to the degree that it's supported by evidence. At no point is it, I'm going to believe this until somebody proves me wrong.
Well, there's a couple of misconceptions I need to go over here. I'm not saying I'm just positing this just because. This is why I started out with the evidence. I laid down several pieces of evidence. And I never said supernatural because I reject that distinction entirely. I don't even know what supernatural means. Every time someone talks about supernatural, natural distinction, it's so arbitrary. I don't know.
Except that you're asserting it's non-material, which I would say is supernatural.
So then is quantum entanglement supernatural because it doesn't happen in space-time? It violates the speed of light.
I don't know.
Is consciousness supernatural?
I don't know.
Well, then there you go. If you're just going to say, I don't know, I'm going to say that.
And I'm not just saying I don't know. I'm saying I don't know and you don't either, but you seem to be claiming that you do.
How do you know I don't know?
I don't know that you don't know.
Then
What I'm saying
that.
is that your argument for why you know is flawed.
How?
Because saying something is the best explanation that we have, we know that the fact that something is the best explanation we have doesn't mean there's any likelihood that it's actually true or that it is the best explanation we will ever have.
It's possible, yeah.
So it's like saying, hey, the butler did it is the best explanation I have.
I think this is where Matt and Mike Jones are talking past each other. They both keep saying best explanation, but they're using that phrase in completely different ways. Mike seems to be saying, this is the best explanation I've got, so I'm going to roll with it until something better comes along. Matt's point is that being the best idea on the table doesn't automatically make it true. Those aren't the same standard. That's an important difference because history is full of explanations that sounded convincing right up until better evidence showed up. If we start believing something just because we can't currently think of a better answer, we're lowering the bar without realizing it. The real value of skepticism isn't that it always has an explanation ready to go. It's being comfortable leaving a question open instead of rushing to close the case. Sometimes saying, I don't know yet, is actually the more demanding position, because it refuses to trade uncertainty for a story that simply feels complete.
Well, first of all, I don't like comparing things to sort of murder investigation for the very simple reason that in a court of law you have to believe beyond all reasonable doubt. That's not how we do science, that's not how we do history, that's not how we do philosophy.
Maybe for a murder trial, but it's not that way for all trials. There's also to a preponderance of the evidence.
That's true. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I'm doing it in the same terms of sort of historical narrative. I believe Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants because the evidence supports it. I don't believe that Hannibal used spaceships because there's no evidence to suggest it. So it's again, I'm just going with what the evidence suggests.
Except that every word that you just uttered is something that we know to be real that is a potential explanation. God is not.
Why?
We don't know God to be, we know elephants are real. We don't know the same about God. You can't show me a God.
Okay, that's
all you can do is, and this is why you're not arguing for a specific God or presenting evidence for a God. You're arguing that there needs to be some explanation for the universe, or there needs to be some explanation for consciousness. It's, you literally said, God, you are merely defining as that which is sufficient as an explanation for whichever of those arguments.
God is just a title. I've given evidence there is a mind behind the universe, and I said, well, this fits the description. I can call it God. If you don't like that title, I don't care. That's your prerogative.
Okay.
Again, going back to what the thing is, it says you don't know what we would call God. This seems like, or we don't have any evidence for God. This seems like circular reasoning. If I give evidence, you're like, well, that can't be demonstrated, therefore there's no evidence for God. It just seems like we're going in a constant circle here. No matter what I present, it could never be evidence for God, because you just assert constantly, as I've seen on your show, God can't be demonstrated. And I don't even know what that means.
So first thing to do is to define God and state what characteristics, and then provide the evidence for it. And if all you're going to do is say God is the title that I give to the thing that explains the universe, okay, I'm completely disinterested.
I don't care if you're disinterested.
I know, but here's the thing. That God is as useless as not knowing the answer. It has no impact on anything that we believe, nothing we do. It cannot get you to a particular God or how you must live your life or anything like that. It is just saying, it is a tautology. The universe has an explanation. I'm going to call that explanation God.
The problem with defining God as whatever explains the universe is that it sounds deep while doing almost no work. At that point, God stops being, a mind, a creator, or anything with clear traits. It becomes a placeholder wearing a religious name tag. You could call the explanation God, Bob, cosmic Wi-Fi, or thingy behind everything, and nothing about the argument changes. That's why Matt's objection is so important. A useful explanation should tell us something. It should narrow the field. It should make some outcomes more expected and others less expected. But if God simply means the explanation for reality, then the claim becomes impossible to miss. Of course reality has some explanation. The real question is what that explanation actually is. This is where the Christian argument trades precision for safety. The less specific God becomes, the easier he is to defend. But the easier he is to defend, the less meaningful the claim becomes. A vague God can survive almost any objection, but only because there is almost nothing left to object to. That's a conclusion protected by vagueness. And here's the bigger issue. Even if Mike proved there was some mind-like source behind the universe, that still wouldn't get you to Christianity. It wouldn't prove prayer works. It wouldn't prove Jesus rose from the dead. It wouldn't prove the Bible is inspired. It wouldn't prove heaven, hell, sin, salvation, or any doctrine people actually organize their lives around. At most, it gets you to a mysterious cosmic something. That is a long way from Sunday church. Matt's point is not that no explanation can exist beyond current science. His point is that you don't get to smuggle in religious meaning by naming the unknown God. If the label adds no testable traits, no moral instruction, no clear identity, and no way to tell one religion from another, then it hasn't explained reality. It has only rebranded ignorance with a capital letter. That's why skepticism remains the stronger position here. It doesn't need to pretend to have the final answer. It only asks that conclusions earn their weight. If your God becomes so abstract that he cannot be identified, tested, or distinguished from not knowing, then maybe the atheist isn't being difficult. Maybe the argument is asking too much from a word. If you enjoyed this debate, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and never forget to support the original creators by watching the full debate on their channels. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.